Reuters recently reported that Canada's cattle herd has shrunk to its lowest level since 1988, just as new U.S. tariffs threaten to raise beef prices on both sides of the border. AP News warned that Canada's foreign minister has branded these duties a Trump tariff tax, insisting that ordinary American consumers, not just Canadian ranchers, will pay the price. The Western producer has described how shipments across the border now carry a staggering premium, with some exporters calculating more than 28,000 Canadian dollars in added costs per load. As ranchers in Texas and Alberta watch their futures collide, the question looms: who really controls the beef on North America's table? For decades, the story of North American beef was one of mutual dependence and relative stability. American ranchers in Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas dominated the global narrative, with sprawling feedlots and unrivaled access to capital. Canada, by contrast, leaned heavily on the United States as its primary customer. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian beef exports flowed south across the border, destined for U.S. supermarkets and steakhouse chains. For many years, this partnership functioned as an unspoken pact. Canada provided reliable supply, while the United States guaranteed an open and lucrative market. From Calgary to Dallas, the system seemed set in stone. Yet cracks had already begun to form long before the latest tariff wars erupted. In the early 2000s, outbreaks of mad cow disease rattled confidence, briefly shutting borders and exposing just how fragile the arrangement truly was. Canada responded by diversifying modestly, sending more beef to Asia and the Middle East, but the US remained the anchor market. Meanwhile, political rhetoric in Washington periodically framed Canadian agriculture as both competitor and partner, an uneasy duality that simmered beneath the surface. By the late 2000s, 10s, and early 2020s, trade tensions hardened. The Trump administration's America First strategy cast a long shadow, targeting steel, aluminum, and eventually agriculture. Each new tariff opened an old wound. Canadian ranchers began to worry less about weather and feed prices and more about presidential tweets. When reports surfaced in 2025 of potential 25% duties on Canadian beef, it was not just another trade dispute, it was a potential rupture of a system that had underpinned livelihoods for generations. What once looked like an enduring alliance was increasingly fragile, setting the stage for a fracture that neither side could easily contain. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in 2025, his trade agenda snapped instantly back to form. Gone were the platitudes about cooperation with allies. In their place came familiar rhetoric of strength, punishment, and leverage. Agriculture, once considered too politically sensitive to touch, was suddenly at the center of a fresh storm. In February, Trump signaled his intent to impose sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian beef and a range of other Canadian exports, effective March 1. The announcement was not made through a carefully orchestrated policy paper or White House briefing, but in the characteristically abrupt way the world had come to expect, a campaign-style rally punctuated by fiery claims that Canada has taken advantage of us for decades. The US argument rested on a pair of interlocking narratives. The first was economic, that Canadian producers, supported by favorable trade rules, had undercut American ranchers in key markets. Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas cattlemen had long complained of competition from the North, but until now, they had lived within the framework of NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. Trump's allies reframed the debate, portraying Canada not as a partner, but as a rival, draining billions from US rural communities. Charts were circulated showing beef import surges, stripped of context and used as evidence of foreign dumping. The second narrative was political. Trump had promised his base, particularly in the American heartland, that he would punish trading partners who did not play fair. With Midwestern states forming the electoral backbone of his coalition, the optics of confronting Canada were irresistible. Beef was chosen, not only because it was symbolic of rural identity, but also because it created the perfect showdown. North America's cowboy image weaponized in a battle for votes. In Washington, officials tried to frame the tariffs as a corrective measure rather than an act of aggression. Trump's trade team argued that tariffs would give U.S. ranchers room to breathe and reset an uneven playing field. They cited cost structures, regulatory differences, and the volatility of Canadian supply. To supporters, this was a way of protecting national sovereignty in food supply chains. To skeptics, it was pure electioneering, an economic grenade thrown across the border to shore up domestic approval ratings. Behind the scenes, industry lobbyists played a decisive role. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association, NCBA, pushed aggressively for measures that would tilt the balance back toward American ranchers. In closed-door meetings, they highlighted the pain points: declining margins in feedlots, consolidation pressures, squeezing smaller operations, and the perception that Canada's system allowed producers to ride on America's market size without reciprocal sacrifice. Trump seized on these arguments, packaging them into a familiar message of America First resilience. But the American strategy carried risks. First, tariffs rarely operate in a vacuum. Every U.S. president since the Second World War had learned that hitting Canada meant hitting America's own consumers. Beef flows back and forth across the 49th parallel, not because of charity, but because of integrated supply chains. Cattle raised in Alberta are sometimes finished in Nebraska, while U.S. steaks end up on Canadian supermarket shelves. Slapping duties at the border meant raising prices for everyone in the chain, from feedlot operators to families in grocery aisles. Economists quickly estimated that the tariffs could add $1 billion annually to American beef costs. Second, the optics of targeting Canada were not universally positive. While Trump's rallies cheered, lawmakers from border states sounded alarms. Senators from Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota, who rely heavily on cross-border trade, warned that retaliation was inevitable. They pointed to past trade skirmishes when Canada responded in kind and U.S. exporters of everything from whiskey to orange juice were caught in the crossfire. The specter of a tit-for-tat war loomed large. Yet Trump doubled down. In press conferences, he portrayed the move as both economic defense and national pride. He described Canadian beef as low quality and accused Canada of flooding Japan and stealing our markets, even though data from Japan's Ministry of Agriculture showed U.S. beef imports still far exceeded Canadian levels. Facts mattered little in the heat of political theater. What mattered was the image, a president raging against outsiders, defending the rancher in a Stetson hat. For Texas ranchers, however, the mood was more complicated. On the one hand, they welcomed the idea of confronting Canada. For years, they had watched Canadian shipments arrive at competitive prices, squeezing margins. Tariffs promised relief, but they also feared unintended consequences. If Canada pulled back from the U.S. market, where would those cattle go? The most likely answer was Asia, particularly Japan, the largest overseas buyer of U.S. beef. By disrupting one pipeline, the administration risked opening another, and not in America's favor. Ultimately, Trump's decision was about more than beef. It was about reasserting a worldview that cast trade as a zero-sum contest. By choosing agriculture as the next battleground, he signaled that no industry was off-limits, even one as intertwined with national identity as ranching. The move electrified his supporters and rattled allies, leaving the North American beef trade at a dangerous crossroads. If the United States framed tariffs as a shield, Canada saw them as an attack, and one that demanded a swift and public answer. Within hours of Trump's February announcement, Ottawa moved from cautious diplomacy to defiant rhetoric. Canada's foreign minister delivered a blunt warning. These duties amounted to a Trump tariff tax, and American families, not just Canadian ranchers, would be the ones footing the bill. The message was clear. This was not just about cattle, it was about the very principles of cross-border commerce. Canadian ranchers, already under strain, absorbed the news with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. In Manitoba, Veteran rancher John Voggs told reporters that he had stopped buying replacement heifers months earlier, anticipating volatility. "You don't invest in the next generation of cattle when you don't know if you can even get them across the border," he explained. His words captured a larger sentiment across the prairies. Uncertainty had become the defining feature of an industry once grounded in stability. By early 2025, Canada's cattle herd had already shrunk to about 10.9 million head, the lowest since 1988, according to Statistics Canada and Reuters. The contraction was not merely cyclical, it was structural, fueled by fears of stranded exports and collapsing profit margins. Ranchers calculated the costs of shipping cattle to the US, with tariffs included, upwards of 28,000 Canadian dollars in extra expenses per truckload, and many simply decided it was not worth the risk. Empty feedlots in Alberta and Saskatchewan became a visible symbol of the policy fallout. Ottawa responded on multiple fronts. Economically, Canada prepared retaliatory tariffs targeting US goods, ranging from whiskey to orange juice, echoing strategies deployed during earlier trade disputes. Diplomatically, Canadian officials fanned out across Asia and Europe, pitching Canadian beef as a premium alternative. Trade delegations visited Tokyo and Seoul, with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada highlighting Canada's strict safety standards and sustainability credentials. While no immediate surge of new contracts was confirmed, the signaling mattered. Canada would not be cornered. The Canadian Cattle Association, CCA, played an active role, lobbying both at home and abroad. They emphasized that Canada's beef industry was not a marginal player, but a global contender, with exports valued at over 4.7 billion Canadian dollars annually. In press briefings, they warned that Trump's tariffs would not only destabilize North America, but also drive Canada into deeper partnerships with Asian markets. Japan, they noted, had long been receptive to diversifying its beef suppliers, particularly given its demand for high-quality, grain-fed cuts. At the community level, the impact was visceral. Small towns in Alberta and Manitoba depend on cattle auctions, feed supply stores, and meatpacking jobs. With herds thinning, ripple effects spread. Fewer cattle meant reduced demand for veterinary services, hay, and trucking. Local economies, already fragile, faced contraction. Canadian ranchers spoke of a generational crisis, where sons and daughters were less inclined to take over family operations that might be wiped out by politics beyond their control. Yet Canada's response was not simply defensive. There was a steely determination to transform the crisis into an inflection point. Policy analysts in Ottawa argued that diversification was long overdue. Canada's over-reliance on the US market had been a vulnerability for decades. Trump's tariffs, however damaging, could accelerate a strategic pivot. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, provided an avenue to strengthen ties with Japan, Vietnam, and other Pacific economies. If the US wanted to play hardball, Canada would play the long game. Still, officials acknowledged limits. Building new markets takes time, and Canada cannot easily replace the US as a destination for 3/4 of its beef exports. The challenge was to endure short-term pain without sacrificing long-term opportunity. In the meantime, ranchers face tough choices: sell off herds, reduce operations, or gamble on volatile futures markets. Canada's reaction revealed both vulnerability and resilience. Vulnerability in its reliance on a single market, but resilience in its willingness to confront the world's largest economy and seek alternatives. To Canadian ranchers, Trump's tariffs were not just an economic weapon, they were a wake-up call, forcing them to imagine survival in a trade environment that might never return to the old normal. By the spring of 2025, the standoff had hardened into a dilemma with no easy exit. On one side stood the United States, determined to project strength through tariffs, but quietly aware that higher beef prices would land hardest on American households. On the other stood Canada, bruised by shrinking herds and empty feedlots, but unwilling to bow to Washington's pressure. Both nations were locked in a posture that felt more like trench warfare than negotiation. The stalemate was not only political, it was structural. Supply chains that once bound the two economies together had been rewired almost overnight. Where cattle once flowed seamlessly across the 49th parallel, tariffs erected invisible walls. The result was inefficiency. Canadian beef looking toward Asia, American ranchers straining to fill domestic demand, and consumers in both countries paying more at the checkout line. International markets watched with unease. Japan, often a neutral arena where North American beef competed on quality and reliability, suddenly found itself at the center of speculation. Would Canadian suppliers pivot eastward? Would U.S. exporters lose ground in a market they had cultivated for decades? Without clarity, importers hedged, spreading contracts across Australia, New Zealand, and South America. The deeper irony was that neither Washington nor Ottawa had achieved its stated goals. U.S. ranchers were not significantly better off. Canadian ranchers were not rescued by new markets, and consumers everywhere faced higher costs. The tariffs had not resolved old grievances, they had simply redrawn the battlefield. By the end of 2025, the beef conflict had crystallized into something larger than tariffs or cattle counts. It was a test of how deeply Canada and the United States could weather political storms without unraveling the economic fabric binding them together. On both sides of the border, ranchers stared at the same uncertainties: shrinking herds, rising costs, and futures clouded by policy decisions far beyond their pastures. The shared supply chain that once symbolized cooperation now served as a reminder of interdependence too fragile to ignore. Japan and other Asian markets watched closely, calculating whether North America could remain a reliable partner. In the race to define the future, will North America triumph together or stumble separately? You're American or Canadian? Share your story below.